a regional/local area where you can get a handle on it and people can actually comprehend it and understand it and actually do things. Our final panellist, before we throw open to you, the floor, is a very distinguished Australian as well, Elaine Henry, who's a member of the Advisory Council of the Foundation, but you'll know that Elaine was for many years has been involved in social and economic policy, most notably in recent times as the head of the Smith family. Please welcome Elaine.
Now, I'm going to do something that you probably weren't expecting, because I'm taking us to the background paper and saying, okay, I'm the last speaker, so I've gone to the last question. And the question is, for those who didn't read it, modern governance is not just a question of top-down or elected officials doing things on our behalf, but of citizens themselves playing a role, working in partnerships with governments at all levels, with decision makers and policy makers on a permanent and ongoing basis to shape and own the future. Now, Steve wrote this, so he asks, is this feasible? So you are going to answer this. This is, the end of a long day, and I'm going to give you a hint. Cast your mind back to those dreadful Queensland floods and think about the Mud Army and how that made you feel. Now, no one organised these great Australians. They organised themselves because, as we've heard before lunch, the power of technology and our social media. So you've got a convergence happening here. So whilst we've heard a lot about opportunities today, there are also challenges for us in the room and for people outside the room, because we're turning things base over apex. Citizenship is now the lens that many of us view everything. And I'm not talking about people in this room or people in Australia. And I am really sad that Australia was, at the turn of the century, really getting into this new paradigm. But guess what? We've gone from being early adopters to really involving our people to what you might call laggards. And what I mean, I'll give you a few examples. In Norway, they've got a slogan that says, nothing about us without us. Okay, you get it? And what were we saying at the turn of the century? Let me take you back. Probably the best known person who said this is Noel Pearson. Don't do things to us, our public are saying. Give us the opportunity to be part of it. So that's one big issue I want us to address, because having been in the vanguard, we're suddenly stalled and we have to do something about it. I then want to go to the topic of relationships being the currency of the 21st century, and we've heard that repeatedly today. But relationships can be positive or negative. And Martin Seligman, the great behavioural economist, has told us it has to be a two-way relationship. And we've had that in discussions today. You've got to give as well as get. And to reinforce that is the view that this century is about contribution, not consumption. And just cast your mind back a few months and try and work out why our population was not taking notice of our leaders and so forth. And we almost got into, and might still, a self-fulfilling prophecy when everyone's telling us our economy is doing well and so forth. Our citizens have made their own mind up and saving in record numbers, and perhaps doing something to distort our economy. So I think this is a big challenge we can't ignore. People are wanting to get involved, which brings me back to the changes, and we've heard much about cultural change. We've perhaps not quite touched on the business case changes and the financial changes that go with it. But I do think we have to rethink the whole of how we set our policies, our processes, and how we actually genuinely want to involve our citizens. And cultural literacy is really fascinating, another word that we've learned. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is not just a figment of few people's imagination, because if you even go to the big society that David Cameron was talking about in 2007, he hit the nail on the head. Now, he might have been coming at this from an economic lens because of their economy, but he said we have got to get used to the fact that our people, human beings, are assets, not liabilities. They're not passive recipients of the services that the state can provide. They've got to be active agents, and to do that, we have to equip them with the life skills of the 21st century. So that brings me back to another major theme that has been recurrent throughout the talks today, which is about education. And I want to drop down a level and get into one of my favourite subjects, which I was pleased to hear a couple of speakers really indicate that we still have a lot of social exclusion in our country. And the digital exclusion is just one of them. Now we might have the cultural exclusion. But there is a way to do something about it, and I'll give a micro example. We have, operating in Australia, a fantastic Indian company. They have a business council with the Australian corporate community. They have a foundation, and they sponsored an opportunity that we had at the Smith family to start to work with some of our diverse cultural young people, help them to get educated in all facets of ICT. But the dream was these kids would go on to university, study IT or commerce, then they'd get an opportunity, and this company was prepared to provide it, for work experience within that company in India. If this worked well, then we'd have exchange students coming back. Now, we've spoken at the various sessions about the Colombo Plan, about scholarships like Fulbright working in this area and so forth. There are already thoughts like this abounding out there. We just haven't brought it together. So I think we might be the citizens. We're sitting here as part of the Global Foundation. But there's a great unwashed out there. How do we pull them in and let them take the leadership? Because in the last session we had this issue about leadership, and we always go to government. Sorry, Greg. And I think it is really this polycentric governance that we should be talking about.
Over here, I think we have Pt3. I see Peter in the gloom.
The issue of governance and accountability. One of the things we know now is that if you don't care what you vote, you end up with a hung parliament. The other thing that we know now, if you don't care about where you invest your money in a bank, if it goes wrong, guess what? Even if you wanted a higher interest rate, you get hit. So one of the issues that we have about governance, and to Greg's point about having a plebiscite, I mean, if we're not confident that our parliament is the place where we want decisions made for our nation, then don't we confuse our young people about what they're meant to be voting for? So one of the problems I think that we have in our society about governance is that we've ended up with lots of different attempts to overlay different people's ideas on critical decision making. And it's become so complicated either at the individual level or a social level to understand, what is the impact of my decision? And I think we need to think about clarifying governance, clarifying accountability, and think about that before we always reach for yet another overlay, another plebiscite, another regulation, because I think if people realised that if you go and chase a 15% interest rate over here, guess what? It probably is not true. If you're not satisfied with your vote and you want to hope that it's going to come up with some other outcome than what it does, guess what? It's not true. I'd just like to inject that into the conversation.
Thanks. Perhaps that's a good moment, Greg, for you to respond, and the other panellists may have a view as well. Let's keep it tight. Keep going.
Yeah. Look, just very briefly on the idea of participation and the plebiscite. What do I think is the problem? I think it's people feel alienated. Mostly it's about engagement at the local level, but let me respond then to this issue of the problem in two ways. Firstly, I don't think Australians voted for a hung parliament. 3 out of the last 8 elections have been determined with two-party preferred results between 49.5 and 50.5. We have close elections a lot of the time. Sometimes those numbers will result in a hung parliament. In 2 out of those 3 very close elections, it didn't. In 1 out of 3, it did. I think that's a random outcome. I don't think it was a collective choice to vote for this. That's what happens where the democratic pendulum swings. The second thing, however, is given that there is a sense of dissatisfaction and sometimes intractability around problems, what I'm proposing is that this can act as a safety valve. It's not an abrogation of government responsibility. It's saying to the people there are occasions and mechanisms and opportunities for participation. And that, in fact, I think is more likely to decrease cynicism, more likely to resolve particular issues. It's not something you would do for the vast majority, but for every 3 or every 5 years there may be 1 or 2 issues that come up. It took away a lot of the emotion around the Republican debate. Whether we'd passed it or whether we didn't pass it, it gave it a sense of legitimate resolution. So that's the idea, but I respect your views absolutely, and we should have a debate around this, but it's a mechanism to give people a sense of participation and to give people actual participation in specific issues.